4,000 meters beneath the Pacific Ocean. Total darkness. Crushing pressure that would collapse a human body in seconds. Water so cold it would freeze you solid if not for the salt content keeping it liquid. The seafloor here is a wasteland of soft sediment and scattered rocks, untouched by sunlight for millions of years. Nothing should be producing oxygen down here. Nothing could be producing oxygen down here, and yet the sensors keep showing the impossible. The readings won't stop. Oxygen levels rising where they should be falling. Oxygen appearing in chambers sealed against the outside world, in water that hasn't seen daylight since before your grandparents were born. The equipment must be broken. It has to be broken, except it's not broken. And what this means, what it truly means if these measurements are real, is that one of the most fundamental rules we thought we understood about life on Earth, about oxygen, about the very air we breathe, might be wrong. Everything might be wrong. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most controversial scientific discoveries of the 21st century. A discovery so shocking that the scientist who made it spent a decade trying to prove himself wrong. A discovery that's ignited fierce debates, corporate pushback, and has profound implications not just for understanding our oceans, but for understanding how life itself might arise on other worlds throughout the universe. We've found oxygen being produced in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. Oxygen created without photosynthesis, without sunlight, without plants or algae, or any living organism doing the work. Dark oxygen. Oxygen from the abyss. And if this discovery holds up under scrutiny, it changes everything. Before we descend into these depths, if you're fascinated by scientific mysteries that challenge what we think we know, a quick like or subscribe helps this channel continue exploring these frontiers. It's a small thing for you, but it makes an enormous difference for me. Now, let's begin this journey. Let's start 4 kilometers beneath the surface and work our way toward understanding what might be one of the most important oceanographic discoveries in decades. The story of oxygen on Earth is a story we think we know. It's taught in every biology class, repeated in every documentary about the history of life. The narrative is simple, clean, and has been accepted as fundamental truth for generations. Earth's early atmosphere had almost no oxygen. Our planet formed 4.5 billion years ago from a disk of dust and gas orbiting the young sun. That early atmosphere was nothing like what we breathe today. It was thick with nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and water vapor. Toxic to us, unbreathable. A reducing atmosphere, chemists call it, meaning it would readily steal oxygen from compounds rather than provide oxygen to them. For the first billion years of Earth's existence, there was essentially no free oxygen. In the atmosphere, none. What little oxygen existed was locked up in chemical compounds in rocks, in water molecules. It wasn't floating free in the air. And then something remarkable happened. Life figured out photosynthesis. Simple bacteria, organisms that we'd barely recognize as living things, developed the ability to capture energy from sunlight and use it to split water molecules. They'd take water, rip it apart using solar energy, and use the hydrogen to build sugars while releasing the oxygen as waste. This process, oxygenic photosynthesis, changed everything. The first organisms to do this were cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, though they're not actually algae at all. They appeared somewhere between 3 and 3.5 billion years ago. And slowly, incredibly slowly, over hundreds of millions of years, they began releasing oxygen into the ocean and eventually into the atmosphere. At first, all the oxygen got absorbed by dissolved iron in the oceans and by exposed rock on land. The Earth was rusty, you might say, with oxygen combining with iron to form rust-coloured layers that we can still see in ancient rock formations today. The banded iron formations, they're called. Layers of reddish-brown iron oxide alternating with darker layers, created when early photosynthetic bacteria produced oxygen that immediately combined with iron dissolved in the oceans. But eventually, after hundreds of millions of years of this process, all the easily oxidized materials got used up. The oceans were saturated, the exposed rocks were oxidized, and oxygen began accumulating in the atmosphere. This is called the Great Oxygenation Event, and it happened roughly 2.5 billion years ago. Suddenly, relatively suddenly on geological timescales, the atmosphere began filling with oxygen. From essentially 0% to eventually the 21% we have today. This was catastrophic for most life on Earth at the time. Oxygen is actually quite toxic to organisms that haven't evolved defenses against it. It's highly reactive, damaging cellular structures, breaking down organic molecules. Most of the anaerobic bacteria that had dominated Earth for the first 1.5 billion years of life were wiped out or driven into isolated environments where oxygen couldn't reach them. Deep mud, the guts of animals, oxygen-free pockets of water. These organisms still exist today, living in places where oxygen can't penetrate, using other chemical processes for energy. But some organisms adapted. Some developed ways to handle oxygen, to neutralize its toxicity, and eventually to use it. Aerobic respiration evolved, the process where organisms use oxygen to break down sugars and extract energy far more efficiently than any other method. With oxygen, you can extract roughly 18 times more energy from the same amount of food compared to anaerobic processes. This was revolutionary. It enabled the evolution of large complexes, multicellular organisms, animals, plants, fungi. Everything you can see with the naked eye owes its existence to the abundance of oxygen in our atmosphere. And all of that oxygen, every molecule of it, came from photosynthesis. That was the story. That was the unshakable foundation. Plants and algae and cyanobacteria capture sunlight. They use that light energy to split water molecules. They release oxygen. That oxygen accumulates in the atmosphere and dissolves in the oceans, and that oxygen supports the vast web of aerobic life that covers our planet. There was no other source. There couldn't be another source. Photosynthesis was the only process we knew of that could produce oxygen in significant quantities. Without sunlight, without photosynthetic organisms, you don't get oxygen. That was the rule. Unbreakable, fundamental. Except, it might not be true. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone sounds like something from a science fiction novel. A vast region of the Pacific Ocean floor stretching between Mexico and Hawaii, spanning roughly 4.5 million square kilometers. That's an area larger than India, larger than all of Western Europe, lying beneath thousands of meters of water in permanent darkness. This is the abyssal plain, one of the flattest regions on Earth, covered in soft sediment that's been accumulating for millions of years. The water above is cold, near freezing, and the pressure is crushing. About 400 times the air pressure at sea level. Stand on the seafloor here, and you'd have the weight of 4,000 meters of water pressing down on you from above. Every square centimeter of your body would be experiencing roughly 400 kilograms of force. Nothing grows here in the conventional sense. No plants, no algae, no coral. Without sunlight, photosynthesis is impossible. The seafloor is mostly barren sediment, fine particles that have drifted down from the surface over millions of years, accumulating layer upon layer, building up slowly at rates measured in millimeters per 1,000 years. But scattered across this sediment, like stones in a desert, are peculiar objects, polymetallic nodules. They look almost like potatoes, rounded lumps ranging from pebble, sized up to roughly the size of a grapefruit. Dark-coloured, often black or brown, with rough textured surfaces. They're scattered everywhere in some regions, covering 30 to 70% of the seafloor. In other areas, they're more sparse. But across the Clarion-Clipperton Zone as a whole, there are estimated to be more than 21 billion tons of these nodules lying on the ocean floor. What makes these nodules interesting? What makes this region significant beyond just scientific curiosity is what they contain. These aren't ordinary rocks. They're rich in valuable metals: manganese, iron, nickel, copper, cobalt, and rare earth elements. The same materials that go into batteries for electric vehicles, into electronics, into renewable energy. Technologies. Wind turbines need these metals. Solar panels need them. The entire green energy transition that the world is trying to make, moving away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy, requires enormous quantities of these exact materials, and traditional mining on land is becoming more difficult and environmentally destructive as easily accessible deposits are depleted. So attention has turned to the ocean floor. Deep-sea mining companies have been eyeing the Clarion-Clipperton Zone for years, studying it, developing technologies to harvest these nodules from the abyssal seafloor and bring them to the surface. The International Seabed Authority, a United Nations organization, regulates mining in international waters. They've issued exploration contracts to various countries and companies, allowing them to study the region, assess its resources, and prepare for potential commercial mining operations. 16 different companies and nations currently hold contracts for exploration in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. The nodules are there, the technology to harvest them is being developed, and pressure is mounting to begin commercial operations. But there's a problem. We know almost nothing about the ecosystems that exist in this region. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone, like most of the deep ocean, has barely been studied. We've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor worldwide. Most of it remains a complete mystery. We have better maps of Mars than we have of our own ocean floor. Scientists have been trying to understand what lives in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, what ecosystems exist there, what species depend on these nodules for habitat, and what the environmental consequences of mining might be. That's what brought marine ecologist Andrew Sweetman and his team to this region. They weren't looking for dark oxygen. They weren't trying to overturn fundamental assumptions about how oxygen is produced. They were trying to measure something much more mundane, the rate at which organisms on the seafloor consume oxygen. This is called sediment community oxygen consumption, and it's a standard measurement in marine ecology. You lower a device called a benthic chamber to the seafloor, seal it against the sediment, and measure how oxygen levels change over time. Organisms breathe oxygen and release carbon dioxide just like we do. So in a sealed chamber, you expect oxygen levels to decrease as organisms consume it. The rate of decrease tells you about the metabolic activity of the community, about how much life is present, about the ecological processes happening in that environment. This is routine science. It's been done thousands of times in oceans around the world. You expect oxygen to go down. It always goes down. Except in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, it didn't, and that's where this story really begins. 2013. Andrew Sweetman, a Scottish marine scientist with the Scottish Association for Marine Science, is conducting research expeditions to the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. He's deploying benthic chambers to the seafloor, measuring oxygen consumption by the sediment communities. Standard procedure, routine measurements. Except the data coming back doesn't make sense. In some chambers, oxygen levels aren't decreasing, they're increasing, not slightly, not within the margin of error. They're increasing dramatically, sometimes doubling or tripling over the 48-hour measurement period. The sensors are showing oxygen being produced on the seafloor in total darkness, 4,000 meters below the surface, where photosynthesis is impossible. Sweetman's first reaction is the same as any good scientist would be. The equipment is broken. Oxygen sensors can malfunction. They can drift, giving false readings. They can be affected by pressure, by temperature changes, by any number of technical issues. So he sends the sensors back to the manufacturer. They test them, calibrate them, and send them back with a clean bill of health. The sensors are working fine. Sweetman tries again. Same results. Oxygen increasing instead of decreasing. He must be doing something wrong. Maybe the chambers aren't sealing properly. Maybe oxygen-rich water is leaking in from outside. Maybe there's some methodological error he hasn't identified. He tries different procedures, different approaches. Results don't change. Oxygen keeps appearing. This goes on for years. Multiple expeditions, different locations within the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, different chambers, different sensors, different methods. And repeatedly, in some chambers, oxygen levels increase, sometimes by small amounts, sometimes dramatically. Sweetman is convinced there's an error somewhere. He tells his students to throw the sensors away. £30,000 worth of scientific equipment, discarded because he's sure they're giving impossible readings. He's been taught, as every biologist has been taught, that oxygen production requires photosynthesis. Without sunlight, you don't get oxygen. That's the foundation of everything. So these readings can't be real. They simply can't be real, but they keep happening. And slowly, painfully, Sweetman begins to accept that maybe, just maybe, something extraordinary is happening on the seafloor, something that shouldn't be possible but apparently is. In 2021, on an expedition sponsored by the Metals Company, a deep-sea mining firm interested in harvesting nodules from the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, Sweetman tries a different approach. He uses a completely different method of measuring oxygen. Not optical sensors this time, but a chemical method called Winkler titration. It's an older technique, more labour-intensive, but it's been used for over a century and it's highly reliable. If the optical sensors were somehow malfunctioning, the Winkler method would show the truth. He deploys the chambers, collects water samples, and analyzes them using Winkler titration. The results match the optical sensors. Oxygen is increasing. He now has two completely independent methods showing the same impossible result. This is the moment everything changes. When you have one method showing something unexpected, you suspect error. When you have two completely different methods both showing the same thing, you have to start considering that it might be real. Sweetman contacts Franz Geiger, a chemist at Northwestern University who specializes in electrochemistry. He describes what he's seeing, the oxygen production in the deep sea, the presence of polymetallic nodules on the seafloor, and asks if there's any chemical process that could explain this. Geiger has an idea. He studied how certain metal combinations can generate electrical currents when exposed to seawater. Rust, for instance, ordinary iron oxide, can produce electricity when combined with salt water. The chemistry is well understood. Different metals or different oxidation states of the same metal in contact with an electrolyte solution can create an electrochemical cell. A battery, essentially. Could the nodules be acting as natural batteries? Could they be generating enough electrical potential to split water molecules through electrolysis? Seawater electrolysis is a real process. It's being studied extensively right now as a potential way to produce hydrogen fuel from seawater without using fresh water. You apply an electrical current to seawater and it splits the water molecules. The hydrogen goes one way, the oxygen goes the other. It requires a minimum voltage of about 1.23 volts under ideal conditions, though practically it usually requires more like 1.5 volts or higher. But it's a well-established process. The question is whether polymetallic nodules could generate enough voltage to make this happen naturally, without any external power source. Sweetman ships several pounds of nodules from the ocean floor to Geiger's laboratory. They test them. They measure the electrical potential on the surface of individual nodules. The results are remarkable. Single nodules show voltages up to 0.95 volts. That's not quite enough to split water. You'd need at least 1.23 volts. But when multiple nodules are clustered together, touching each other or very close together, the voltages can add up, just like connecting batteries in series. Put enough nodules together, and you could theoretically reach the voltage needed for electrolysis. Geiger and Sweetman now have a hypothesis. The polymetallic nodules scattered across the seafloor of the Clarion-Clipperton zone might be acting as natural geobatteries, generating electrical currents that split seawater into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen bubbles up into the water column, where the sensors detect it. The hydrogen, being lighter, probably also bubbles up and disperses, though they didn't specifically test for hydrogen in the early experiments, something that became a point of criticism later. In July of 2024, Sweetman, Geiger, and their team of 16 co-authors published their findings in Nature Geoscience, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in earth sciences. The paper is titled Evidence of Dark Oxygen Production at the Abyssal Seafloor. It reports multiple lines of evidence showing oxygen production in sealed benthic chambers deployed in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. It proposes the geobattery hypothesis as a possible explanation, suggesting that polymetallic nodules might be facilitating seawater electrolysis through naturally generated electrical potentials. The paper is careful, acknowledging uncertainties, calling for further research. But the core claim is clear and revolutionary. Oxygen is being produced on the seafloor in the absence of light, and this process might have profound implications for deep-sea ecosystems, for our understanding of how oxygen cycles work, and even for our theories about how life might originate on other worlds. The scientific community's response is immediate and intense. Some researchers are excited, seeing this as a potential breakthrough that could reshape our understanding of ocean chemistry and deep-sea ecosystems. Others are deeply skeptical, questioning the methodology, the interpretation of the data, and whether the conclusions are justified by the evidence. This is how science should work. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and when someone claims to have found a fundamental new source of oxygen production, that claim needs to be rigorously examined, challenged, tested, and verified before it can be accepted. But the criticism that emerged wasn't just scientific, it was also corporate and intensely personal. The metals company, the deep-sea mining firm that had sponsored some of Sweetman's research expeditions and provided ship time for his work, immediately released a scathing statement. They called the research fundamentally flawed and raised serious concerns about the validity of the data and conclusions. This was unusual. The metals company had supported the research, had access to the raw data, and their scientists had been aware of what Sweetman was finding. But now, with the paper published and generating headlines around the world, they were publicly attacking it. Why? Because this discovery, if true, had major implications for deep-sea mining. If polymetallic nodules are producing oxygen that supports deep-sea ecosystems, then removing those nodules through mining could have catastrophic environmental consequences that we don't yet understand. Environmental groups opposing deep-sea mining immediately seized on Sweetman's findings as evidence that mining should be halted, or at least postponed until we understand these ecosystems better. The metals company and other mining interests saw this as a threat to their plans. They'd invested millions in developing the technology to mine these nodules, in securing contracts and licenses, in preparing for commercial operations. And now a scientific paper was suggesting that these nodules might be fundamentally important to deep-sea life in ways nobody had anticipated. The economic stakes are enormous. The nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton zone contain an estimated 270 million tons of nickel, 230 million tons of copper, and 44 million tons of cobalt. That's enough to meet global demand for these metals for decades. The value is measured in trillions of dollars. Companies and nations have invested heavily in positioning themselves to access these resources, and scientific uncertainty about environmental impacts was something they didn't want clouding the picture. The metals company released a detailed technical critique of Sweetman's paper, written by their own scientists and outside consultants. They argued that the oxygen increases Sweetman measured could be explained by trapped air bubbles in the equipment, by leaking seals on the benthic chambers, by contamination from surface water, or by a variety of other methodological errors. They pointed out that previous studies in the same region, including some conducted by European research teams using similar equipment, hadn't detected oxygen production. Why did Sweetman see it when others didn't? They noted that Sweetman had conducted control experiments where chambers were deployed without touching the seafloor, sealed with only seawater inside, no sediment or nodules. In some of these control chambers, oxygen levels had also increased, which would seem to contradict the hypothesis that nodules were responsible. Why would oxygen increase in chambers with no nodules present? These were legitimate scientific questions, the kind of detailed technical critique that any major discovery should expect. But the tone of the criticism was harsher than typical scientific debate. The metals company wasn't just raising questions, they were declaring the research invalid, calling for it to be retracted or extensively corrected. Other scientists also began publishing critiques. Matthias Herkel, a marine biogeochemist at the Geomar Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research in Germany, noted that his team had conducted similar benthic chamber measurements in nodule fields years earlier and had never observed oxygen production. They'd seen the opposite, oxygen consumption, exactly what you'd expect. Haeckel suggested that perhaps air bubbles trapped in the equipment during deployment could explain Sweetman's results. This had happened to Haeckel's own team decades ago. They'd thought they detected oxygen production, but it turned out to be trapped air. Norwegian exploration company Adepth Minerals, which has no connection to nodule mining but has an interest in deep sea resources more generally, published their own analysis of Sweetman's paper. They identified what they considered to be significant methodological flaws, questions about calibration, about the timing of measurements, about how certain data points were handled. They called for more rigorous validation, more comprehensive reporting of methods and data before the scientific community should accept these extraordinary claims. By autumn of 2024, at least 5 separate critiques of Sweetman's paper had been submitted to various journals, all questioning different aspects of the methodology or interpretation. None of these critiques had gone through peer review yet. Many were published as preprints, scientific papers posted online before formal peer review to invite community feedback. But they were creating a narrative that Sweetman's discovery might be built on shaky foundations. Sweetman defended his work. He and his co-authors released statements pointing out that their results had been extensively peer-reviewed before publication in Nature Geoscience, one of the most rigorous journals in the field. The reviewers had examined the methods, the data, the interpretations, and found them sound enough to warrant publication. Sweetman noted that he'd been the biggest skeptic of his own data for nearly a decade, spending years trying to prove these results wrong, discarding sensors, testing alternative hypotheses, before finally accepting that something real was happening. He emphasized that he'd used multiple independent methods, optical sensors and chemical titration, both showing the same results. He acknowledged that the control chamber data needed further investigation, but argued that this didn't invalidate the core finding that oxygen was being produced in chambers containing nodules and sediment. The mechanism might not be fully understood yet, but the phenomenon appeared to be real, and Sweetman pointed out something important that was getting lost in the technical debate. Since the paper was published, other researchers had contacted him privately, saying they'd seen similar results in their own data from nodule fields, but had dismissed them as errors. They'd assumed their equipment was malfunctioning, just as Sweetman had initially assumed. Now, seeing Sweetman's published results, they were going back and re-examining their old data, wondering if they'd overlooked something significant. This is actually common in science. Sometimes discoveries go unrecognized for years because they contradict expectations so strongly that researchers assume there must be errors rather than considering that the unexpected results might be real. The phenomenon even has a name, the Semmelweis reflex, the tendency to reject new evidence or knowledge because it contradicts established norms or beliefs. So where does the science stand? As of now, the dark oxygen hypothesis remains controversial and unproven, but it hasn't been definitively refuted either. The critiques have raised valid questions that need to be addressed, but critics haven't yet provided a completely satisfactory, alternative explanation for all of Sweetman's observations. If it's just trapped air bubbles, why does the effect seem to be strongest in chambers with nodules? If it's leaking seals, why weren't there similar issues in thousands of other benthic chamber deployments around the world? If it's some methodological error, why did two completely different measurement methods both show oxygen increases? The scientific method demands skepticism, especially for extraordinary claims, but it also demands that we take surprising observations seriously and investigate them thoroughly, rather than dismissing them out of hand because they contradict our expectations. The debate continues, and critically, there's a way to settle it. More experiments, better controlled, more comprehensive, with additional measurements including testing for hydrogen production, which would provide stronger evidence for or against the electrolysis hypothesis. Fortunately, such experiments are being planned. If dark oxygen production is real, if polymetallic nodules are indeed generating oxygen through geobattery-driven electrolysis, what does this mean for the ecosystems of the deep sea? The abyssal seafloor is one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Cold, dark, under crushing pressure, far from the productive surface waters where photosynthesis occurs and food is abundant. And yet, life exists here. Not in great abundance compared to shallow waters or terrestrial ecosystems, but it's there. Sea cucumbers, brittle stars, amphipods, worms, bacteria, and many other organisms make their homes in the soft sediments or attached to polymetallic nodules. These organisms need oxygen to survive. Most deep sea life, like most life on Earth, relies on aerobic respiration, using oxygen to extract energy from food. But where does that oxygen come from? The traditional answer is that it comes from above. Oxygen is produced at the surface by photosynthetic organisms, phytoplankton mostly, single-celled algae drifting in the sunlit upper waters. That oxygen dissolves in seawater and eventually makes its way to depth through ocean currents. The global ocean circulation system, sometimes called the Great Conveyor Belt, moves water masses around the planet. Cold, dense water sinks at the poles and flows along the ocean floor toward the equator, carrying dissolved oxygen with it. This process can take centuries or even millennia. Water that sinks in the North Atlantic might not resurface until it reaches the Indian or Pacific Ocean hundreds or thousands of years later, but it carries oxygen, slowly delivering it to the deep ocean. That's been our understanding of how abyssal ecosystems get the oxygen they need. Surface production, deep circulation. But what if there's another source? What if the seafloor itself, in regions with polymetallic nodules, is producing oxygen locally? This would change our understanding of these ecosystems fundamentally. Instead of being entirely dependent on oxygen delivery from the surface, abyssal communities might be partially or even primarily sustained by local oxygen production. The nodules aren't just habitat. They're not just physical structures that organisms attach to. They might be active participants in the ecosystem, generating the oxygen that makes life possible in these regions. This would make the nodules far more important ecologically than anyone realized. Removing them through mining wouldn't just remove habitat. It would remove the oxygen source itself, potentially collapsing the entire ecosystem. Think about what this means practically. Deep-sea mining operations propose to harvest nodules by driving collector vehicles across the seafloor, essentially giant vacuum cleaners that suck up nodules and pump them to a surface ship. These operations would remove nodules from vast areas, potentially hundreds of square kilometers, over the lifetime of a mining operation. If those nodules are producing oxygen that supports the local ecosystem, removing them would create dead zones, areas where oxygen levels drop so low that most organisms can't survive. The sediment communities would suffocate. Mobile animals might be able to move to adjacent areas that still have nodules, but sessile organisms, those attached to the seafloor, would die. And even mobile animals need somewhere to go. If mining operations are spread across the entire region, there might not be refuge areas with sufficient oxygen. There's also the sediment plume issue. When mining equipment disturbs the seafloor, it kicks up enormous clouds of fine sediment that can drift for kilometers or even tens of kilometers on ocean currents before settling. This sediment can smother organisms that depend on filter feeding, clog gills and respiratory structures, and generally degrade environmental conditions far beyond the immediate mining site. If nodules in these surrounding areas are producing oxygen but get buried under a layer of mining sediment, their oxygen production might be blocked, extending the impact area even further. We don't know how thick a sediment layer a nodule can tolerate and still function as a geobattery. We don't know if partially buried nodules produce less oxygen or the same amount. We don't know how long nodules need to recover if they're temporarily buried. These are critical questions that need answers before large-scale mining begins. And here's the really unsettling part. We've barely studied the biodiversity of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Every expedition that goes down there discovers new species, organisms that have never been seen before, that might exist nowhere else on Earth. In a 2023 survey, scientists collected samples and identified over 5,000 different species or potential species in the region. Of these, roughly 90% were new to science. 90%. That's an extraordinarily high proportion of unknown biodiversity. Most of these organisms are small invertebrates, worms, crustaceans, and the like. Not spectacular or charismatic. You won't see them in nature documentaries. But they're part of complex ecological networks that we don't understand at all. What eats what competes with what, how do nutrients cycle through these systems, what's the relationship between different species? We don't know. If we start mining before we understand these ecosystems, we might cause extinctions before we even know what we're destroying. Species that exist nowhere else on Earth, that took millions of years of evolution to develop unique adaptations to this extreme environment, could be wiped out permanently. And we might never know what we lost. From a purely pragmatic perspective, setting aside ethical considerations about species extinction, this is foolish. Deep-sea organisms have already proven to be sources of valuable compounds. Extremophil bacteria from deep-sea environments have yielded enzymes used in biotechnology, compounds being investigated for medical applications, insights into how life can adapt to extreme conditions. Every time we study a new extreme environment, we find organisms doing biochemistry in novel ways that sometimes lead to useful applications. Destroy these ecosystems before we study them, and we lose that potential forever. The dark oxygen discovery, if it holds up, makes the case for caution even stronger. These ecosystems might not just be unusual, they might be fundamentally different from any other marine environment we've studied, operating on principles we didn't know existed. Oxygen production without photosynthesis would be a unique feature found nowhere else in the ocean. An ecosystem powered partly by geological processes rather than purely by biological ones. That's worth studying, worth understanding, worth protecting, at least until we comprehend what we're dealing with. One of the most exciting implications of the dark oxygen discovery extends far beyond Earth's oceans. It touches on one of the biggest questions in science: how did life begin? For decades, the prevailing view has been that life required oxygen, or at least that complex life. Multicellular organisms, animals, require oxygen, and oxygen requires photosynthesis. Therefore, life as we know it requires sunlight. This has shaped our thinking about where and how life might arise elsewhere in the universe. We look for planets in the habitable zone, the region around a star where temperatures allow liquid water to exist on a surface. We assume life needs sunlight for photosynthesis to produce oxygen and organic compounds. But what if that's not true? What if oxygen can be produced without sunlight through geological processes? This opens up entirely new possibilities for where life might exist, both in Earth's past and on other worlds throughout the universe. On Earth, consider the early oceans before photosynthesis evolved. The traditional story is that the first life forms were anaerobic, not using oxygen because there wasn't any oxygen available. Anaerobic metabolism evolved first, and only later, after cyanobacteria developed photosynthesis, did aerobic organisms emerge. But what if there were pockets of oxygen in the early oceans produced by geological processes similar to what we're seeing in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone? What if certain seafloor environments had electrochemical reactions generating oxygen locally, creating oases where aerobic metabolism could have evolved much earlier than we thought? This could change our timeline for how life evolved, potentially explaining some puzzles in the fossil record, where we see evidence of more complex organisms earlier than seems consistent with when photosynthesis is thought to have become widespread. Beyond Earth, consider ocean worlds. In our solar system alone, we have multiple moons that almost certainly have liquid water oceans beneath their icy surfaces. Europa, orbiting Jupiter, has an ocean estimated to contain more water than all of Earth's oceans combined, hidden beneath an ice shell perhaps 10 to 20 kilometers thick. Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, has an ocean beneath its ice that occasionally vents into space through geysers at the South Pole, geysers that the Cassini spacecraft flew through, sampling the water and detecting organic compounds and salts. Titan, another moon of Saturn, might have a subsurface ocean as well, along with its well-studied surface lakes of liquid methane and ethane. Even Ganymede and Callisto, two more of Jupiter's moons, probably have subsurface oceans. These ocean worlds are potential habitats for life. But until now, it seemed like a long shot because they're ice-covered. Sunlight doesn't penetrate to the liquid water beneath the ice. Without sunlight, you can't have photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis, you can't produce oxygen or organic compounds in significant quantities. So any life that exists there would have to be entirely dependent on chemical energy, on chemosynthesis, using reactions between dissolved minerals and gases to produce energy. Chemosynthetic life exists on Earth, in hydrothermal vents and similar environments, but it tends to be relatively simple, mostly microbial. The energy yields from chemosynthesis are lower than from photosynthesis or aerobic respiration, so it can't support large complex organisms or high biomass. But if oxygen can be produced without photosynthesis, if electrochemical reactions on the seafloor can split water and generate oxygen, then these ocean worlds become much more interesting as potential habitats for life. Europa's ocean floor might have similar processes. If there are minerals on Europa's seafloor with the right chemical properties, if there's enough geological activity to provide the energy needed, you could have oxygen production in complete darkness beneath kilometers of ice. That oxygen could support aerobic organisms, potentially much more complex in energy, demanding than purely chemosynthetic life. You could have an entire ecosystem, not just microbial slime-coating rocks, but potentially larger organisms, mobile creatures, even something like fish, or their alien equivalents, all powered by dark oxygen from geological processes. Enceladus is particularly intriguing because we know its ocean is in contact with its rocky core. The plumes that vent into space contain silica particles that could only have formed from hot water reacting with rock. That means there's active water-rock interaction happening on Enceladus's seafloor, and if water is reacting with rock under pressure, and temperature conditions similar to Earth's abyssal seafloor, could similar electrochemical processes be occurring? Could Enceladus's ocean have zones of oxygen production? We don't know, but it's now a testable hypothesis. Future missions to Enceladus could look for oxygen in the plume samples. If we detect molecular oxygen coming from Enceladus's ocean, that would be extraordinary evidence that these processes might be widespread on ocean worlds, throughout the solar system, and potentially throughout the galaxy. The implications extend even further. Exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars, are now known to be extremely common. We've discovered over 5,000 confirmed exoplanets, with thousands more candidates waiting for verification. Many of these are in their star's habitable zone where liquid water could exist on the surface. But there's also a recognition that subsurface oceans might be even more common. Any planet or large moon with a rocky core and a water-rich composition could potentially maintain a liquid water ocean beneath an ice shell, through a combination of tidal heating, radioactive decay in the core, and residual heat from formation. These subsurface oceans would be shielded from harsh surface conditions, from radiation, from temperature swings, from impacts. They might be more stable over geological time than surface oceans, and therefore potentially better environments for life to arise and persist. If dark oxygen production is possible in these environments, the number of potentially habitable worlds in the galaxy increases dramatically. We're not limited to planets in the narrow habitable zone around stars. Any world with liquid water and the right geological chemistry could potentially support life. That's a profound shift in how we think about the prevalence of life in the universe. Instead of rare, life might be common, even abundant, just not in the places we've been focusing our search. Not on surfaces bathed in starlight, but in dark oceans beneath ice, powered by chemical batteries on alien seafloors. So the stakes for understanding dark oxygen production on Earth extend far beyond deep-sea mining regulations or ecological concerns. They touch on fundamental questions about life, about where it can exist, how it can arise, what conditions are necessary for it to thrive. If Sweetman's hypothesis is correct, if polymetallic nodules really are producing oxygen through electrochemical processes, we're not just learning something new about our oceans, we're learning something new about the potential for life throughout the universe. In January 2026, weather permitting, a research vessel will depart from San Diego, California, heading for the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. This won't be a routine research expedition. It will be the first expedition specifically designed to test the dark oxygen hypothesis, to put Sweetman's claims under the most rigorous scrutiny possible, and to hopefully settle the scientific debate one way or another. The expedition is funded by the Nippon Foundation, a Japanese philanthropic organization, notably not by any deep-sea mining company. This independence is crucial for scientific credibility, removing any perception that financial interests might influence the results or interpretation. Andrew Sweetman and his collaborators will be deploying custom-built landers, more sophisticated than any previously used, designed to eliminate the potential sources of error that critics have identified. These new landers can descend to 12,000 meters depth, twice as deep as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, giving them capability to study other abyssal regions if needed. They'll have multiple redundant oxygen sensors using different measurement principles, allowing real-time cross-validation. If all sensors agree, that's strong evidence the readings are accurate. If they disagree, it suggests measurement problems that need to be resolved before drawing conclusions. Critically, the expedition will include measurements that weren't part of the original studies. They'll be testing specifically for hydrogen production. If seawater electrolysis is really occurring, splitting water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen, then hydrogen should be detectable along with the oxygen. Previous studies measured oxygen but didn't look for hydrogen, an oversight that critics have pointed out. Detecting hydrogen would be powerful, supporting evidence for the electrolysis hypothesis. The team will also use isotope analysis, measuring the ratio of different oxygen isotopes in the produced oxygen compared to the oxygen already dissolved in seawater. This can help determine whether the oxygen is coming from water splitting or from some other source. They'll conduct more extensive control experiments, deploying chambers in different configurations, chambers with nodules, chambers without nodules, chambers with nodules but sealed off from the seafloor, chambers open to sediment but with nodules removed. By varying these conditions systematically, they can narrow down exactly what's necessary for oxygen production to occur. Is it specifically the nodules? Is it something in the sediment? Is it the combination of nodules and sediment? The different experimental treatments should reveal the answer. They'll also measure electrical potentials on nodule surfaces in situ on the seafloor, not just in laboratory studies. The voltage measurements Geiger conducted were on nodules brought to the surface and tested in lab conditions. Do nodules generate the same voltages when they're on the seafloor in their natural environment? Measurements in situ will help confirm or refute that aspect of the hypothesis. The expedition plans to visit multiple sites within the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, sites with different nodule densities and compositions. If oxygen production is linked to nodules, it should be stronger in areas with more nodules, and perhaps vary depending on what metals are present in the nodules and in what proportions. Mapping this variation geographically would help understand the conditions necessary for the process and its overall contribution to deep-sea ecosystems. Sweetman has expressed confidence that this new expedition will validate his findings. He stood by his data through a year of intense criticism and maintains that the phenomenon is real. He acknowledges that the mechanism might not be fully understood yet, that the geobattery hypothesis might need refinement or might turn out to be wrong in some details, but he's confident that oxygen production is occurring. He's seen it too many times, with too many different methods, to believe it's all instrumental error. Critics are waiting to see what the new data shows. Science advances by testing and retesting ideas, by looking for flaws and weaknesses in hypotheses, by demanding that extraordinary claims be backed by extraordinary evidence. If the new expedition reproduces the oxygen production results under well-controlled conditions, skepticism will diminish. If it shows hydrogen production alongside the oxygen, confirming electrolysis, that will be very hard to dismiss. But if the new expedition finds no evidence of oxygen production, or if the results are ambiguous and inconsistent, then Sweetman's original findings will be cast into serious doubt, and the dark oxygen hypothesis will likely be abandoned or heavily revised. This is how science is supposed to work: debate, criticism, and ultimately more experiments to resolve the disagreement. By the end of 2026, we should have answers. Either dark oxygen production is confirmed as a real phenomenon that needs to be incorporated into our understanding of ocean chemistry and deep sea ecology, or it's refuted as an artifact of methodology that misled researchers for a time but doesn't actually occur in nature. Either outcome advances science. Confirming dark oxygen would be revolutionary, opening new lines of research, new questions about ocean processes and the origin of life. Refuting it would close off a wrong path, allowing researchers to focus their efforts on more productive directions. Both outcomes are valuable. The worst thing that could happen would be continued ambiguity, results that neither clearly confirm nor clearly refute, leaving the question unresolved and controversial for years to come. Hopefully, with better experimental design and more comprehensive measurements, the 2026 expedition will provide clarity. One thing is certain, regardless of how this scientific question resolves: the deep ocean remains a frontier, one of the least explored regions of our planet, full of mysteries we haven't even begun to uncover. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the deepest parts of our own oceans. We've sent robots to Mars, rovers that have explored kilometers of terrain, analyzing rocks, searching for signs of past life, mapping geological features. Mars is roughly 225 million kilometers away at its closest approach to Earth, and we've studied it extensively. Meanwhile, the deepest point in our ocean, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, is less than 11 kilometers below the surface, and we've only been there a handful of times, briefly, with limited scientific equipment. The ocean covers 71% of Earth's surface. That's 361 million square kilometers of water, and below the water, the seafloor stretches across that entire area, most of it deeper than 200 meters, much of it deeper than 4,000 meters. We've mapped the ocean floor using satellite measurements of sea surface height, which can detect slight variations caused by underwater mountains and trenches. But this gives us only low-resolution data, enough to see large features like mid-ocean ridges and deep trenches, but not enough to see details smaller than several kilometers. It's like looking at Earth from space and trying to map cities and roads. You can see the general outline of continents, but you can't see houses or streets or individual trees. To truly explore the ocean floor, to understand what's there and what processes are occurring, you need direct observation. You need submersibles, remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, landers, and human-occupied submarines diving to depth, taking samples, making measurements, observing with cameras and sensors. This is expensive, time-consuming, and technologically challenging. Water pressure increases by roughly 1 atmosphere, about 100 kilopascals, for every 10 meters of depth. At 4,000 meters, the pressure is 400 atmospheres. At 10,000 meters, it's 1,000 atmospheres. Building equipment that can withstand this pressure while still functioning, while carrying sensors and cameras and robotic manipulators, is difficult and costly. But it's not impossible. We have the technology. We've built submersibles that can reach the deepest points in the ocean. Autonomous vehicles can survey large areas of seafloor. Landers can sit on the bottom for months collecting data. The limiting factor isn't technology, it's funding and prioritization. Ocean exploration doesn't capture public imagination the way space exploration does, even though the ocean is closer and potentially more immediately relevant to human welfare. We depend on the ocean for food, for climate regulation, for oxygen production. The ocean drives weather patterns, absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, regulates global temperatures. Understanding the ocean is critical for understanding how Earth's climate system works and how it might change in the future. Deep-sea ecosystems are part of that larger system. The seafloor isn't just a barren wasteland 4 kilometers down that has no connection to life at the surface. Everything is connected. Nutrients cycle through the ocean. Organic matter sinks from the surface to depth, feeding deep-sea organisms. Those organisms respire, releasing carbon dioxide and nutrients back into the water. Deep ocean currents eventually return to the surface, bringing nutrients that support photosynthetic organisms, which produce organic matter that sinks to depth. It's a continuous cycle linking surface and depth, and we need to understand how it works. Dark oxygen, if it's real, would be part of this cycle, an unexpected source of oxygen in deep waters that could affect how carbon and nutrients are processed by deep-sea organisms. It would mean that our models of ocean chemistry are incomplete, missing a term that could be significant in certain regions. Even if it turns out that dark oxygen is localized to nodule fields and isn't a major contributor to global ocean oxygen budgets, it would still be important for understanding the specific ecosystems it affects, and it would raise the question of whether there are other processes occurring in the deep ocean that we haven't discovered yet, other surprises waiting to be found if we just look closely enough. Every time we've studied the deep sea intensively, we've found things we didn't expect. Hydrothermal vents, discovered in 1977, were a complete surprise. Nobody predicted that you'd find hot water gushing from the seafloor, rich in dissolved minerals, supporting entire ecosystems based on chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. Giant tube worms 2 meters long, clams the size of dinner plates, crabs, fish, all thriving in total darkness near these vents, fed by bacteria that derive energy from the chemicals in the vent water. The discovery revolutionized biology, showing that life doesn't need sunlight, that ecosystems can be based on geological energy rather than solar energy. Cold seeps, areas where methane and other hydrocarbons seep out of the seafloor, support similar ecosystems. Whale falls, the carcasses of dead whales that sink to the ocean floor, create isolated oases of food in the desert of the abyss, supporting specialized communities of scavengers and decomposers that can feed on the whale's remains for decades. Brine pools, super salty water denser than the surrounding seawater, collect in seafloor depressions, creating underwater lakes complete, with shorelines where seawater meets brine. These environments have extreme conditions, high salinity, sometimes toxic concentrations of dissolved chemicals, and yet they too support life, organisms adapted to conditions that would kill most creatures. Each of these discoveries changed our understanding of what's possible, where life can exist, how ecosystems can be structured. Dark oxygen production, if confirmed, would join this list of surprising deep ocean processes that expand our knowledge of how the planet works. It would remind us that despite centuries of ocean exploration, despite all our technology and scientific knowledge, we still have a lot to learn about the blue planet we live on. The ocean still holds mysteries, still has the capacity to surprise us, still requires humility from scientists who think they understand how natural systems work. The debate over dark oxygen is more than just a scientific dispute about methodology and interpretation. It's also a reflection of larger tensions between scientific research, environmental protection, and economic interests. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone sits at the intersection of all three. Science wants to understand it, to study the ecosystems and processes occurring there. Environmentalists want to protect it, to preserve biodiversity, and prevent potentially catastrophic damage to barely studied ecosystems. Industry wants to exploit it, to harvest the valuable metals that could power a green energy transition. These goals aren't necessarily incompatible, but they create conflicting pressures and incentives. From industry's perspective, delays in mining are costly. Companies have invested millions in developing technology, in securing contracts, in conducting preliminary surveys. The longer mining is postponed, the longer those investments sit without generating returns, and there's uncertainty about whether regulations will change, whether environmental concerns might lead to bans or restrictions that make mining economically unviable. So there's pressure to move forward, to get mining operations started before the regulatory environment potentially becomes more restrictive. From this perspective, scientific uncertainty is frustrating. The The deep sea has always been mysterious. If we waited until we understood everything perfectly, we'd never be able to do anything. At some point, we have to accept that there will be unknowns and move forward with appropriate precautions and monitoring. From the environmental perspective, this is precisely the wrong approach. We're talking about an ecosystem that took millions of years to develop, organisms that might exist nowhere else, processes we're only beginning to understand. Once mining begins, once the nodules are removed and the sediment is churned up, the damage is done. You can't undo it. You can't replace nodules that took millions of years to form. You can't bring back species that go extinct. And history is full of examples where we've exploited natural resources without understanding the consequences until it was too late. Overfishing collapsed fisheries, deforestation disrupted climate patterns, pollution contaminated water supplies and caused health crises. Again and again, we've prioritized short-term economic gain over long-term environmental health, and we've paid the price. Deep-sea mining threatens to be another example unless we proceed with extreme caution. From the scientific perspective, what's needed is more research before making irreversible decisions. We need to understand what's there, how it works, what the consequences of disturbance might be. Science operates on a timescale of years or decades for major research programs. Understanding an ecosystem thoroughly requires multiple research expeditions, long-term monitoring, experiments to test hypotheses about how the system responds to perturbations. This takes time and funding. But science also needs to engage with the real-world implications of what it discovers. Researchers can't just study things in isolation, publish papers, and ignore how their findings might be used or misused. If dark oxygen is real and has implications for mining policy, scientists have a responsibility to communicate that clearly, to explain what's known and what's uncertain, to help policymakers make informed decisions. The International Seabed Authority is supposed to be the body that balances these interests, that regulates mining in international waters in a way that considers both economic benefits and environmental protection. But the ISA has been criticised as too industry-friendly, too focused on enabling mining rather than ensuring robust environmental safeguards. Environmental groups and some nations have called for a moratorium on deep-sea mining until we know more, until we have effective regulations in place and a better understanding of what we're protecting. Other nations and industry interests resist a moratorium, arguing that with proper precautions and monitoring, mining can proceed responsibly without waiting for perfect knowledge. The dark oxygen discovery has become ammunition in this debate, cited by different sides to support their positions. Ultimately, these are questions that society has to answer through political and regulatory processes. How much uncertainty is acceptable before proceeding with economically beneficial but potentially harmful activities? How do we weigh present economic needs against potential future environmental costs? Who gets to make these decisions and based on what criteria? Science can inform these questions, can provide data and analysis and projections of likely outcomes. But science can't make the value judgments about what we should prioritize. Those are fundamentally political and ethical questions that need to be decided democratically, with input from multiple stakeholders, including scientists, industry, environmental groups, and the broader public. What science can do is continue investigating, continue testing hypotheses, continue trying to understand how the deep ocean works. The 2026 expedition will provide more data about dark oxygen. Other research programs are studying deep-sea biodiversity, the potential impacts of mining, the rates at which ecosystems might recover from disturbance. All of this knowledge feeds into better decision-making, even if it doesn't guarantee that decisions will be perfect or that everyone will agree with them. Knowledge reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty enables more informed choices about how to move forward. So here we are, standing on the edge of a possible new understanding of how oxygen can be produced, of how deep-sea ecosystems might function, of where life could exist in the universe, or standing on the edge of recognizing a cautionary tale about how easy it is to be misled by unexpected data, about the importance of rigorous methods and skeptical analysis. The story isn't finished yet. The dark oxygen debate continues. Research is ongoing. The 2026 expedition will provide crucial new evidence, and decisions about deep-sea mining will have to be made in the face of incomplete knowledge, as difficult decisions always are. But regardless of how the science resolves, One thing is clear. The deep ocean matters. It matters for understanding Earth systems, for predicting how climate change will affect our planet, for discovering what life is capable of in extreme environments, for making informed decisions about whether and how to extract resources from the seafloor. We need to study it, understand it, and ultimately protect it, because once it's gone, once ecosystems are destroyed and species driven to extinction, we can't get them back. The ocean is not an infinite resource. The deep sea is not a wasteland. It's an integral part of our planet, full of life and processes we're only beginning to appreciate. Tonight, we've explored one of the most controversial discoveries in modern oceanography. The possibility that oxygen, the gas we breathe, the gas that makes complex life possible, the gas we thought could only be produced by photosynthesis, might be generated in the lightless depths of the ocean by electrochemical processes we didn't know existed. If this is true, it rewrites part of our understanding of the ocean. It opens new possibilities for where and how life might exist on other worlds. It adds urgency to calls for caution in deep-sea mining, and it reminds us how much we still have to learn about the planet we live on. If it's not true, if further research shows that dark oxygen is an experimental artifact, a misinterpretation of data, then we'll have learned something different but equally valuable. We'll have learned about the challenges of making measurements in extreme environments, about the importance of rigorous experimental design, about how science self-corrects through critical analysis and replication. Either way, the process of investigating this question, of debating it, of designing better experiments to test it, is how knowledge advances. This is science in action, messy and contentious at times, but ultimately directed toward understanding reality as clearly and accurately as possible. As we close, remember that the ocean covers most of our planet. It's not a separate thing from the land where we live. It's intimately connected to everything, to weather, to climate, to the air we breathe, to the food we eat. What happens in the deepest parts of the ocean affects us, even if we never go there, even if we never see it directly. And we have a responsibility to understand it before we change it, because changes at these depths might be permanent. Once we start mining the ocean floor at industrial scales, once we begin extracting millions of tons of nodules, churning up the sediment, altering the chemistry and physical structure of vast areas, we can't undo it. We need to make sure we know what we're doing before we do it. The discovery of dark oxygen, controversial as it remains, has sparked exactly the kind of scientific investigation and public discussion that we need. It's forcing us to think more carefully about what we know and don't know about the deep ocean. It's pushing scientists to design better experiments, to challenge assumptions, to look more carefully at data they might have dismissed before. It's raising awareness that the deep sea is not empty, not barren, not irrelevant to the rest of the planet. It's a place worth studying, worth understanding, and worth protecting. So as you think about the ocean, as you consider the vast dark depths 4,000 meters down where pressure is crushing and light never penetrates, remember that even there, surprising things might be happening. Oxygen might be bubbling up from rocks on the seafloor. Ecosystems might be powered by geological batteries. Life might be thriving in ways we never imagined. The universe is strange and wonderful, full of phenomena that violate our intuitions and expectations. And the deep ocean, despite being right here on our own planet, despite being closer than the Moon or Mars or any other world we've explored, remains one of the strangest and most wonderful frontiers we have left to explore. There's something humbling about realizing how little we truly know. We live on this planet, we've studied it for centuries, we've developed sophisticated technologies to probe every corner of it, and yet the ocean floor remains largely unexplored. We've sent humans to the Moon, 250,000 kilometers away. 12 astronauts have walked on its surface, collected samples, conducted experiments, and returned to tell us what they found. We've landed multiple rovers on Mars, operated them for years, driving them across the Martian surface, analysing rocks, searching for signs of past life. We've sent spacecraft to every planet in our solar system, flown, past Pluto, left the solar system entirely with Voyager 1 and 2, now sailing through interstellar space. These are incredible achievements, testaments to human ingenuity and our drive to explore. But while we've been looking outward to distant worlds, we've neglected the alien world beneath our own oceans. More people have been to space than have visited the deepest point in our ocean. More humans have walked on the moon than have descended to the Challenger Deep. We know the surface of Venus better than we know most of the ocean floor, despite Venus being tens of millions of kilometers away, with a surface temperature hot enough to melt lead and atmospheric pressure that would crush a submarine. This isn't because the ocean is harder to explore than space. In many ways, it's easier. You don't need rocket launches. You don't need to escape Earth's gravity. You don't need to deal with the vacuum of space or cosmic radiation. You just need to go down, to build vessels that can withstand pressure rather than vacuum, to work in darkness and cold rather than the harsh environment of space. The ocean is right here, accessible from ports around the world, so why have we neglected it? Partly because it's out of sight, out of mind. The ocean surface is familiar. We sail ships across it, we swim in it near shore, we see it from beaches and boats. But what's below? That's invisible, hidden beneath an opaque layer of water that we can't see through beyond a few meters, even in the clearest conditions. Space, paradoxically, is more visible. We can see stars, planets, galaxies with telescopes. We can watch the moon rise every night. The universe displays itself to us, at least partly, inviting observation. The ocean hides what it contains, revealing nothing from the surface. To see the deep ocean, you have to go there, and going there is expensive and difficult and offers less immediate spectacle than images of distant galaxies or Mars rovers. But that doesn't mean it's less important. In fact, for our immediate survival and well-being as a species, understanding the ocean is far more critical than understanding distant planets. The ocean regulates our climate, produces much of our oxygen, provides food for billions of people, influences weather patterns that affect agriculture and habitability across entire continents. When we damage the ocean, we damage ourselves. When we fail to understand it, we make decisions blind to their consequences. The dark oxygen debate is just one example of how much we still have to learn. Here's a process that might be fundamental to deep-sea ecosystems, that might affect how carbon and nutrients cycle through the ocean, that might have implications for where life can exist throughout the universe, and we only discovered it, maybe discovered it, we're still not sure, in the past decade. After centuries of ocean science, we're still finding things this basic, this fundamental. What else are we missing? What other processes are occurring that we haven't detected yet? What other surprises await in the depths? The ocean is patient. It's been here for billions of years and will be here billions more, long after humanity is gone. The processes occurring in its depths operated long before we evolved to study them, and will continue long after we're extinct. From the ocean's perspective, we're a brief flicker, barely noticeable. But from our perspective, the ocean is everything. It's the reason complex life exists on Earth. It's the reason our climate is relatively stable and habitable. It's the foundation of global ecosystems and economies. We depend on it completely, and yet we treat it as something we can exploit, pollute, and damage without consequences. Dark oxygen, whether it proves real or not, should make us pause and reconsider. If something this fundamental, oxygen production itself, can occur in ways we didn't know about, in places we haven't studied thoroughly, what else are we getting wrong? What other assumptions are we making that might be false? Every scientific discovery, especially surprising ones, should inject humility into how we approach the natural world. We don't know everything. We don't even know what we don't know. The map of our ignorance is larger than the map of our knowledge, and it always will be. The best we can do is keep exploring, keep questioning, keep testing our ideas against reality, and be willing to change our minds when the evidence demands it. This is why the scientific debate over dark oxygen, contentious as it's been, is ultimately a good thing. It means science is working as it should. Someone made an unexpected observation, proposed a hypothesis to explain it, published their findings, and now the scientific community is scrutinizing those findings intensely. Critics are identifying potential problems, proposing alternative explanations, calling for better experiments. Proponents are defending their work, planning follow-up studies, gathering additional evidence. This back and forth, this clash of ideas and interpretations, is how we get closer to truth. Not through accepting the first explanation offered, but through rigorous testing and debate that eventually narrows down what's actually happening from what we might have thought was happening. By the end of 2026, we'll know more. Maybe we'll know that dark oxygen is real. and we need to revise our understanding of ocean chemistry. Maybe we'll know it was a mistake, a measurement artifact that seemed compelling but doesn't actually occur in nature. Either way, we'll be smarter than we are now. We'll have asked the right questions, done the experiments, analysed the data, and come to conclusions based on evidence rather than assumptions. That's the promise of science, not that it always gets things right immediately, but that it has mechanisms for self-correction, for testing ideas, for rejecting false hypotheses and refining true ones. It's not perfect. It's done by humans with all our biases and errors and limitations, but it's the best method we've developed for understanding reality. And reality, as we're discovering, is often stranger than we imagined. Who would have thought that rocks on the ocean floor might produce oxygen? Who would have predicted that ecosystems could be powered by geological batteries? These ideas sound like science fiction, like something from a novel rather than serious scientific research. But nature doesn't care about our expectations. It operates according to physical laws, chemical reactions, biological processes that unfold whether we understand them or not. Our job as scientists, as informed citizens, as curious humans, is to observe carefully, think critically, test rigorously, and remain humble about how much we still have to learn. The ocean teaches this lesson repeatedly. Every time we think we understand it, it reveals something new: hydrothermal vents, cold seeps, whale falls, brine pools, and now possibly dark oxygen. The list of surprises keeps growing, and beyond these specific discoveries, there's the broader realization that we're exploring a world that's as alien as any planet in our solar system, just closer to home. The deep ocean is genuinely otherworldly. The conditions are so different from the surface that organisms living there have evolved bizarre adaptations we're only beginning to understand. Bioluminescence, the ability to produce light chemically, is common in the deep sea where sunlight never penetrates. Many organisms flash and glow, using light for communication, for hunting, for defense. Gigantism occurs in some deep-sea species: giant squid, giant isopods, giant amphipods, all reaching sizes much larger than their shallow water relatives. The reasons aren't fully understood, but it might relate to cold temperatures, low metabolic rates, and different ecological pressures in the abyss. Extreme longevity is found in some deep-sea organisms. Certain sponges and corals live for thousands of years, growing slowly in the cold, dark waters, accumulating centuries of growth while empires rise and fall on the surface above them. These organisms were alive when ancient Rome was at its height, when the pyramids were new, when humans first learned to write. They've persisted in the darkness while all of human history unfolded, and they continue growing today, oblivious to the rapid changes happening in the world above. We're only beginning to catalogue the diversity of life in the deep ocean, only starting to understand how these ecosystems function, how organisms interact, how energy and nutrients flow through communities living thousands of meters below the surface. And we're making these discoveries at the same time that we're contemplating industrial exploitation of the seafloor. The timing is unfortunate. Ideally, we'd explore thoroughly, understand completely, and only then make informed decisions about whether and how to extract resources. But economic pressures don't wait for science to catch up. Decisions are being made now, regulations are being written now, mining technologies are being developed now, all while fundamental questions about deep-sea ecology remain unanswered. This is the context in which the dark oxygen discovery matters so much. It's not just about one surprising finding or one scientific debate. It's about whether we'll have the wisdom to proceed carefully, to prioritize understanding over exploitation, to recognize that once we damage these ecosystems, we can't undo that damage. The precautionary principle suggests that when an action might cause harm, but we're uncertain about the consequences, the burden of proof should fall on those proposing the action to demonstrate it's safe, rather than on those opposing it to prove it's harmful. In the context of deep-sea mining, this would mean not mining until we're confident we understand the consequences, rather than mining until problems become obvious. Whether society will adopt this approach remains to be seen. The pressures to exploit resources are strong, the economic incentives are powerful, and patience is in short supply when there are profits to be made. But the ocean isn't going anywhere. The nodules have been sitting on the seafloor for millions of years. They'll still be there in 10 years, in 50 years, in a century if we decide to wait until we understand what we're dealing with. There's no urgent need to rush into mining before we're ready. The metals will keep. Our ignorance about the ecosystems we might damage, however, can't keep indefinitely. At some point, we need to commit to exploring and understanding before we exploit and potentially destroy. Thank you for joining me on this dive into the abyss, into one of the most fascinating scientific controversies of our time. If you found this exploration compelling, if you want to keep following stories about science pushing the boundaries of what we know, a like or subscribe helps immensely. It supports the creation of more deep investigations into the mysteries that surround us, the questions that challenge our assumptions, and the discoveries that change how we see the world. And remember, the next time you breathe in, you're taking in oxygen. You know it came from photosynthesis, or at least you thought you knew. Maybe some of it came from 4,000 meters down, from metal lumps sitting in the darkness, from processes we're only now beginning to discover. The ocean still has secrets. It's still teaching us, still surprising us, still showing us that reality is richer and stranger than our theories predicted. And sometimes, those secrets, those surprises, those strange new pieces of reality change everything we thought we understood. The deep ocean waits, patient and mysterious, and we're only beginning to understand what's down there in the darkness.